Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As they went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. The word of the Lord. Our Old Testament lesson this morning is about King David. King David is a warrior, a musician, a politician, a poet. David is one of the most complicated characters in the Bible. He's pulled in one direction by ambition and lust, but who, despite all his flaws, seemed to continually be pulled in the other direction, that of seeking after God's own heart. Now, when we were children in Sunday school, our first encounter with David was when we were taught that when he was a young man, he'd been out on the battlefield facing Goliath. Goliath was that Philistine soldier who stood somewhere between 6.5 to 9 feet tall for 40 days. Now, the number 40 appears in the Bible a lot of times. And when we see the number 40, we always know it means a long time. So for 40 days, Goliath had been challenging the Israelites to send out their best soldier to face him in a one-on-one, winner-take-all fight. No one took up the challenge until here comes little David, who was there just to take food to his older brothers. And he declares he's not scared. He picks up 5 stones, his sling, and heads out to face Goliath. Now, we all remember how this turns out. David takes down Goliath with 1 stone. So have you ever wondered why he takes 5 stones in the battle? Well, it wasn't because he didn't trust God. He knew he could take Goliath out with just 1. But he took the extra ammunition in case Goliath's brothers decided to join into the fray. The part of the story that doesn't get recounted much in Sunday school is what happens immediately after that stone hits Goliath in the head. David goes up to the fallen giant and decapitates him and takes this trophy back to Jerusalem to show everybody. Thanks. Well, after this victory, David becomes very popular, especially with King Saul. But Saul's son, Jonathan, becomes jealous when the king invited David to live in the palace with him. Now, trouble really began brewing when the citizens of Jerusalem started to proclaim that David was a more successful warrior than even King Saul. Saul becomes so jealous that one night at a party, he throws a spear at David. Not just once, twice he throws spears at him. But David dodges them both times. Saul then becomes afraid of David. He knew David was more popular, and he also thought that God might be on David's side too. So he sends David out to war in hopes that he's going to be killed. But the plan backfired, and David was victorious in battle. And David realized that the king had it out for him. So he went into hiding, and Saul chased after him. David had a chance to kill King Saul, but he chose not to. When Jonathan and then Saul end up getting killed in battle by the Philistines, David is made king, and David rules for 40 years. There's that number 40 again. So now David is the king, and he sets out to unify the lands of Israel. So he does so by going to war with the tribes that stood in his way. So there were many wars, and they lasted many years. And David and his men were victorious. David and his armies defeated the Philistines, the Moabites, the Arameans, the Edomites, the Ammonites, those from Amalek and from Ramah, and the soldiers from King Hadadezer. I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, but he can let me know later if it's wrong. That's a lot of battles. So it's written that the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. While David had victory on the international front, his struggles weren't over. One day from his roof, he saw Bathsheba. She was married to Uriah. Well, David wanted to marry Bathsheba. So what did he do? He sent Uriah to the front lines of battle, and he told the generals, once Uriah enters into the fray, pull your troops back, thus ensuring the death of Uriah. Now, it's a wonder, isn't it, that David is so favorably mentioned in the Bible? Makes you wonder if he didn't have one of the great public relations agents of all time. Well, David does marry Bathsheba, but their first child dies in infancy. Their second child is, know the story? Solomon. The passage we read this morning from the book of Samuel is called Nathan's Oracle, and it concerns the building of the temple. This is the first time that Nathan is mentioned, but it's not the last time because he returns in a few chapters later during the Bathsheba saga. The situation was this: after all the bloodshed and all the battles, the fight against the external enemies was finally over. David could rest from the enemies of the Israelites. So he constructed a palace to live in. And he began to feel very guilty. Here he is in this fine house, but the Ark of the Covenant was being kept in a tent. Nathan passes along a word from the Lord that it'd be okay to build a permanent place for the Ark. Now, the Ark, you remember, was built to carry the 10 Commandments that Moses brought down from the mountain. Well, along the way, some other things get thrown in there, like some manna from the Exodus, we're told, gets put in there. But all along, a special tent had been constructed to house the Ark and to serve as their center for worship. The tent and the Ark went wherever the Israelites were during the Exodus. And it had continued that way ever since, even when they crossed over into the Promised Land. Well, David now wanted to construct a more permanent structure where people could worship God. It was to be a unifying place for all of Israel. In his way of thinking, it was sort of like that movie Field of Dreams, in which the lead character played by Kevin Costner, builds a baseball diamond in the middle of a cornfield. If you build it, Costner believes, they will come. If I build it, David thought, the people of Israel will come. So as David sets out to build the temple, God tells him to wait, because David was a man of war, and because of his own transgressions, David is not allowed to build the temple. Instead, he has to pass that task on to his son, Solomon. Solomon uses 80,000 stonecutters and 70,000 laborers to construct this house of worship on a place now called the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The inside of the temple was 90 foot long and 30 foot wide, and the foyer was 45 foot high. Inside it was a symbolic veil, and behind it was the Holy of Holies, the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant would rest. If we translate Josephus' description of that part of the building into some modern measurements, it stood about 20 stories tall. Made of cedar and cypress, the building was also covered in gold. And all, we're told, it took 23 tons of gold to cover everything. Even some of the floors were covered in gold. It had to be one of the finest houses of worship ever created. Funny thing, though, its construction didn't solve all the problems for the Israelites. This very notion of having a house of God is actually a bit of a play on words. The Hebrew word that we translate as house can also, it can mean two things. It can mean a dwelling place kind of house. It can also mean a dynasty. So Nathan's oracle to David tells him that besides the part about David building a temple, the Lord makes a house for David. And if it means dynasty, that a family shall endure forever, then perhaps that oracle is a bit of a prophecy, because we know that Jesus is descended from the house of David. Well, the Israelites build this giant temple, and they soon forget that the worship of the Lord does not come from houses made by hands, but by the hearts of those who put their trust in God. To that end, the temple, as elaborate as it is nothing more than a tool. A very ornate tool, but a tool nonetheless to help point people towards worshiping God. The difficulty of having an ornate structure is that it can easily become an end in itself. What was meant for devotion becomes an absorption with maintenance and preservation. Maybe for the Israelites, they were better off when they just had a tent. There's a great symbolism in having a tent. As the people moved in the Exodus, the tent and the ark came with them. It shows that God is eternally on the move, and God is always with his people. God isn't just in one place. The mission of God is out there. And we must be ready to move our tents as God leads us. When David became older, the time of his reign began to close. There were those who sought his power and his crown. David again had to flee, only to return once again when a foe had fallen in battle. The struggle for succession ended when David named Solomon to be the new king. David was aware of the relationship between himself and the community, and the relationship between himself and with God. As an individual, he acknowledged his responsibility to be used by God on behalf of others. We, like David, are to serve the purpose of God. And like David, one day our sun will set, our stars will decline, and our leadership will be passed on to the next generation to be used by God on behalf of others. If you build it, they will come. The Israelites did. For over 400 years they did. The great Temple of Solomon stood as a house of worship and as a central focal point for Israelites until some other people came. The attraction of all that gold and the riches led to a raid and the temple being destroyed in 586 BC by King Nebuchadnezzar. At that point, the Ark of the Covenant disappears, led to many searches by archaeologists and also Harrison Ford. 50 years later, the temple was rebuilt around 535 BC. Centuries later, it got a facelift during Herod's rule and was still standing during Jesus' time, until it was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AD. What remains of the great temple today is the Western Wall, sometimes called the Wailing Wall. That first temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed, and later the second temple was too. But does this mean that David and Solomon were wrong to plan it and to construct it? I think the answer is no. The value of a place of worship comes from its service to God and not the gratification that it gives to people. The value of a church is not its buildings, it's the people. People that seek God, that worship God, that love one another. We at Kirkwood do not have golden floors, cedar walls, a 20-story building, but in our hearts, we seek God here. We worship God here, and we give support to his people here. It's not the buildings, it's the people. So in the eyes of God, this church is made of gold. May God and his mercy come to heal us, to bless us, and to forgive us. In the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit.